Welcome to Money Sense with Shiandra, your weekly financial coaching session. Before we start today's session, I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. If your home refrigerator were to break down today and needed to be replaced, are you in a financial position at this very moment to buy a brand new refrigerator with cash without dipping into money allocated for other expenses? If you were to lose your job tomorrow or, God forbid, get ill and couldn't work, would you be able to cover all of your expenses over the next 3 months? Life is filled with unexpected circumstances, and there's money that we need to have readily available when unexpected circumstances come. Today, in episode 2, we're sitting down with our in house financial planner, Nathaniel Butler of Druba Solutions, to talk about building an emergency fund. So, how is the emergency fund different from the savings line item that's in our household budget? In the last episode, in the creating and managing a household budget, we talked about how we would want to save 20% of our income. So, is that the emergency fund? Talk to us about what's the difference here.
Well, first and foremost, the first thing you need to do is establish the emergency fund. And the reason for that is life happens. Life is not like one of those sports games where you could call timeout, get your resources together, and then get back into the game to respond. So to your point in regards to that portion of the salary that is allocated 20% to savings, I would say to you that that savings really is a combination of your personal savings, saving up for a home, or saving for retirement. But before you even get into any of those savings, we need to take that 20%, the entire 20%, or even more than 20% to ensure that we have an emergency fund as soon as possible. And I want to be clear, there are two types of emergency funds. One is a starter emergency fund, and the second one is a fully funded emergency fund. So with the starter emergency fund, for those who have an income that is under 26,000 per annum, I am advocating that you put aside $750 in the next 90 days. That's a total of 3 months. For those who have an income that is over 26,000 per annum, you need to put aside $1,500. And I think you have to just look at your budget and figure out how best you're going to put that aside. Now, we know at minimum we're going to put aside 20%. But in some cases, in order for us to achieve that goal within the next 90 days, we may have to cut our budgets and reduce our expenses, or maybe increase our income to a point that we can hit the target of the $750 or the $1,500 in the starter emergency fund. Now, when you look at the fully funded emergency fund, you have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses saved. So the first thing is you need your budget to determine how much is 1 month's expenses or total expenses. You multiply that by 3, you multiply it by 6, and then you have a kind of a range of how much money you need to put aside. My advice is once you understand your risk profile, if you're someone who is conservative, you want to save at least a minimum of between 5 to 6 months of your expenditure. If you're somebody who's a risk taker, you probably want to save at least a minimum of 3 to 4 months worth of your expenditure. And like I said, once you calculate what your average total monthly expenditure is, it's just a multiplication of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months. Once this is done, you have a fully funded emergency fund. And usually you want to kind of put the fully funded emergency fund together after you have control over your budget, after you have quite a bit of a good surplus coming in that can go towards your savings, and more importantly, after you would have gotten rid of some of the bad debt that doesn't really help you in regards to your financial journey.
Let's talk about some of the disadvantages of the alternatives that people use for their emergency fund. So, credit cards, right?
Mhm.
why not? There's so many things that people that I need to save for. Why do I not just have a credit card that I just use that for emergencies, and that's my emergency fund? What's the disadvantage there?
No, it's a question I get a lot, and let me first come out the gate and say I'm not against using credit cards. I personally own credit cards. However, when you use a credit card as your basic form of emergency or your first line of defense in regards to the emergency, and there is no savings, what tends to happen is that emergency stays on that card. Or what I mean by that is it becomes a part of your balance. And you carry that balance throughout the different months with no intentions of reducing it completely or paying off your card. And what tends to happen is if you have an extended balance and you don't pay it off, it does adversely affect your credit score. And more importantly, you find that people just keep adding on top of the balance, so they never really dealt with the emergency. They just keep it passed on from year to year, month to month. And so that's why I'm not a big advocate of credit cards alone with no savings. Credit cards pay for the emergency for on the onset, and then before the month ends, you take your savings and wipe out the balance. Yes, but credit cards alone and with no plan of saving up the money to finally pay off the emergency, because technically all you did is defer the payment. You never really tackled the payment. You just deferred it. You just switch it from one pocket to the next. It's still in your pocket. It still needs to be dealt with. And so that's my biggest issue with the credit card, and persons using it strictly and solely as their emergency fund.
Yeah. One alternative to emergency funds, or sort of source rather, that I will admit that I've had to quickly run and turn to is one of the quick loan sort of
Mhm,
places.
mhm,
You have a number of them here. You have Omni, you have places like Cash and Go,
mhm.
and so that's sometimes that's some people's first sort of go-to, for getting funds for emergencies. What are your thoughts on that?
So here's our reality. Everybody's starting off at a different place in life, and sometimes you find yourself in a situation whether you're the working in your working class or you're just starting off. Things happen and you don't have enough time to accumulate funds to respond to the issues at hand. And I want to be really sensitive. I
Yeah.
really want to be sensitive to persons who are in that route, because it's not easy. First and foremost, it's not easy. You're in a position where every resource that you receive goes right back out the door before
Bills.
the month ends. And
Hmm.
then to add to that, you have these sporadic events or challenges that require you to provide additional money. So I would say for the persons who utilize it, I understand, and it's fine in the moment. But my biggest point I want to advocate here is once we obtain these plans or obtain these credit facilities, let's have a plan quickly getting out of them.
Yeah.
Let's have a plan on how we may have to utilize some debt management or debt reduction strategies, to minimize our level of exposure. Because most cases I've found that once you utilize some of these credit facilities, there's a high propensity that if another challenge comes, you may have to further extend it or further or rewrite these credit facilities in order to take out more money. And so I want to make it very clear. If you're in a situation, you need quick cash and you're using it, that's fine. But let's have a plan how quickly we can get out of it, out of that predicament, and be on the path. And it takes time. I want to make this very clear. It's not going to happen overnight, but it takes time to migrate into a position of financial security, financial peace, financial independence. But the key thing is you have to have a plan. You have to have a plan. Um, but in regards to it being a emergency fund, it should not be. I don't want to be very clear. It should not be the first resort.
Yeah.
It should not be the first resort.
And that's why in episode 1, with creating and managing a household budget, we did talk about some ways to cut back on some of those expenses so
Correct.
that you can work towards having enough funding to start building that emergency fund.
And I would go a step further to say not only cutting back, but in some cases, we have to also increase our income.
Yes.
The lifestyle that we're living in most cases comes at a cost. And I say that in the sense of one income alone may not be able to sustain that lifestyle. So when we talk about savings and we talk about emergency funds, what may end up happening is your primary income covers your basic expenditure, but the secondary income needs to be able to take care of your lifestyle. And things like saving for the emergency fund may have to come from a secondary income. It may be irregular, it may be consistent, it may be a part time job or freelancing or whatever it is. I would say that persons need to engage it.
I remember being frustrated in my 20s that I didn't have access to certain things that I felt would propel my career. I would complain to my dad, and he would always respond, Fiandra, what's in your hand? My dad was referencing the story in the Bible when God spoke to Moses through a burning bush. Moses had just been given the assignment to lead the Israelites out of bondage. When Moses asked God, what if they don't believe that you appeared to me? God replied, Moses, what's in your hand? In Moses' hand was a staff, a rod that God would go on to use to demonstrate signs and wonders. As you begin to think about ways to increase your income, I want to ask you the same question God asked Moses and that my father asked me. What's in your hand? Many of us have income producing gifts, talents, and assets that we are not utilizing or maximizing. I encourage you to stop focusing on what you don't have. Look at what you do have and find a way to monetize it. One of the things I do want to talk about, and in fact, I had a very interesting conversation with an HR director of a very large organization, and what she was sharing, she was telling me about the situation and the predicament that a number of her employees are currently in. At this point right now, and this is something that they're getting ready to implement, at this point right now, they didn't have any limitations on the salary deductions or restrictions on the amount.
Yeah.
And so persons were just getting salary deduction after salary deduction, where she told me some people are taking home $50.
Yep, I can see it.
$50 out of their paycheck.
I've been in the field of financial services for the last 16 going on 17 years. And I've been monitoring this. This is a phenomenon. It's a quiet storm. Let me give you an example. As far back as about 15 to 20 years, the government of the Bahamas had to put in place a policy that restricted public workers from taking home or going beyond a debt service ratio of 70%. They were taking home less than 30% of their income, to the point that a good population was taking home less than $100.
Yeah.
You fast forward, many other companies that have a staff complement over 100 persons, 200, 300 persons, they will tell you as soon as they onboard anybody in the organization, you find that one out of every 3 persons will ask for a job letter with the intention of getting a loan.
Yeah.
And what tends to happen is as time progresses, they just rack up the different forms of loans and credit facilities. And then it gets to a point where they're taking home less than 30% of their income. And that is, and I want to be clear, that's not because of what we sometimes feel that persons are just spending nilly-willy and not really taking care of their financial health. That's just because they may not be in a situation that they can afford the lifestyle that they're living.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're living above their means in some cases. It's just that the level the variables in their life doesn't afford for them to accumulate enough resources to respond to life. So as a result of it, in order to respond, you have to utilize debt to deal with some of the immediate needs. I don't want to paint the picture that, oh, that's only a few persons in the organization, or that's a few persons who are at a certain level in the organization. No, 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 no. It doesn't matter what the income is. You find that persons who are making very high earners and those who are part of the working class, both parties are involved in this. You could have somebody who's making a particular salary, leave that company, go to another company, make a higher salary, and they get caught up in lifestyle inflation.
Persons may not know what lifestyle inflation is. So explain that.
So let's just say you make $30,000. You got a promotion that bumps you up to now $40,000. So there's an extra $10,000 within the year that you would have. Within the first 2 months, you will experience that increase. But thereafter that, because you're gonna find expenses just naturally. In some cases, you can't even identify what those are expenses are that you will naturally take on and put you right back in the same predicament you were in before you even get the promotion.
Paycheck to paycheck.
You are right back into a paycheck to paycheck. And simply because most persons who are in that don't budget, they have what we call the mental budget. So they're not conscious of the expenses that are putting them back into that paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, yeah. So let's say, okay,
Mhm,
we've saved up, started saving the funds. We have the ability to now put together this emergency fund, right?
mhm, mhm.
Where do we store this? Where is this being stored?
I love the question. I love this because, persons who are listening and watching us, for the most part, we still have this notion of, somebody should be under the mattress. We have this notion of, I'm not really good with money, so I really can't hold on to it. I know if it is accessible, I'm going to spend it. So let me address the different individuals or types in the room. For those of you who are disciplined, let me put that out there, are disciplined, but you just want to be in reach of your funds, it's okay to have a portion of it at home and a portion of it in a financial institution. For those persons who are not as disciplined and you're just truthful and you're transparent, which is up, you just know that you're not as disciplined, it is okay for you to first and foremost have it separate from your primary account in a different account, a separate account. It could be in the same financial institution or it could be at another financial institution. It's your choice. But you have to go with the mindset of only defined emergencies I will use that account. Those who have commingled their funds with a partner, whether it's a life partner, whether it's a significant other, whether it's a spouse, there has to be once again, a separate account from the primary account where only defined emergencies that you utilize these funds. And if you want to have a small portion at home in the case of an emergency happens at home and you need quick cash, well, make sure that both parties or who all needs to know where that is in the house. And if you're going back to the family meeting conversation, that is the perfect time to do a quick audit to see how much funds are there. Because what tends to happen is persons don't replenish the funds that they have in the house once they use it for an emergency.
Mhm. You took us back to the room, right? The table that you talked about in episode one with creating and managing a household budget. And you talked about the importance of really communicating with your loved ones and the people who are in the household. And so, what would you say would be some questions that we can ask ourselves and use as a litmus test? Because in the moment, everything can feel like an emergency fund, but not
Yeah.
everything necessarily needs to come like, okay, the toaster stop working. Do we go into the emergency fund to go and buy a new toaster? Is that, what give us some questions that we could put on the table and ask that will really help us determine whether or not an expense should come from the emergency fund.
No, I love the question. I love this point because we have to define it. We have to define emergencies. And for what I've learned is that different families, different individuals define it in different ways. What one group may see as an emergency, another group may not see that as an emergency. But I think the core of it, the core areas that everybody should have, and if they want to add to it, it's fine. But the core areas is definitely number one, you have to have or be in a position that you can be able to move around. Transportation is key. So if the car goes down, there's a flat tire, these things that prevent you from having that necessary movement. Because when other forms of emergencies happen, you won't be able to have that same level of accessibility to move around. So definitely want to include that. Someone passing in the family, especially when somebody's life is at risk, transportation, and then of course you have some core appliances inside the house. Now I'm not saying everything, but there's some core appliances in the house. For example, you could have your fridge go. That is, you could imagine now if you have a household, especially if it's beyond one person and you got an active household, you can't go too long without having or being able to store food for the household. And so I think most persons kind of get the gist of what they want to consider as emergencies. I would always tell persons, especially when I have some of my engagements where I would share, is that sometimes people pass and they may not necessarily be on the same island or in the same country as you. You can't tell them, hey, put the funeral on hold, let me gather some money together before I could come. So things will happen in life. Something may happen to your child that is medical related. You may have to tap into the emergency to respond to that. Or last but not least, you may have an adult dependent that something may happen to them. You may need to tap into that emergency, even if it's just as simple as buying medication for them and they ran out and they don't get paid until a certain time in the month. Well, these are things that we have to just be level-headed with it. And I would say the last point I want to make on this, the one thing you should not use the emergency for, and I've seen it, is retail therapy. There is no justification for that. I understand you might be stressed. I understand the pressures of life. But at the same time, we need to define what these emergencies are to ensure that we don't spend it on things that may not be considered an emergency.
I want to speak briefly from experience about the importance of having an emergency fund and just savings in general. When my dad died several years ago, no one in my immediate family was on the island. Both my brother and I were living and working in the US, and my mother was visiting my brother at the time. Within a few hours of getting the call that my dad had passed, which was completely unexpected, plane tickets had to be booked to get to Nassau, and preparation for a funeral had to be made. While funeral homes sympathize with the grief we experience after the passing of a loved one, at the end of the day, they're running a business. And when it's time for you to pay, they don't want no story. Your loved one may have life insurance, which is good, but life insurance doesn't give you the money you need when you're sitting in the funeral home and you've got a deposit to pay. So you gave us some homework. You said in the next 90 days, for those of us who don't have any savings, you said you could start it with the starter, which is within the next 90 days, if you're making less than, I believe you said 26,000?
26,000.
If you're making less than 26,000 per year, you want to set aside for your emergency fund $750.
Correct.
In the next 90 days. And so you want to put that, I think really having it in a completely separate account from the one that you use for your day-to-day sort of spending is best. You'd agree?
No, I totally agree with you. When it comes down to money, it's all about being truthful and being transparent with yourself.
Yeah.
If you are disciplined, then if you're disciplined, those persons who are disciplined, they can put that in that account and no worries or concerns that they can allocate that. But for the far majority, and myself included, for all of us, or all of we, No, I got to be in a separate. That
Okay.
has a separate account.
Yeah. So less than 26,000, that's $750 in the next 90 days. And for those making more than 26,000, in the next 90 days, we need to be putting aside, you said $1,500,
Correct.
correct? 1,500.
Correct.
Now, my question to that is, okay, an emergency happens, right? And that wipes out a good portion of that $750. That wipes out, or you have a number of emergencies. Um, how do we avoid this cycle of, because we said we want to sort of prioritize having an emergency fund before we start focusing on some of our financial goals? How do we
Mhm.
not get into a cycle of, well, I can't focus on my financial goals because I'm trying to, keep this. I got to put money back into the emergency fund. How do we avoid that?
So it's a great question. The Starter Emergency Fund helps us whilst we take the time out and start to work on some of our financial goals, and also now put in place now the fully funded emergency fund. Once you get to the fully funded one, even if you use some of it and you have to replenish it, there's still more cushion in place in order for you to take some time to replenish it versus the starter. Once that is gone, there is no cushion. There is no cushion, and you have to quickly get it back. And I would say to the person who is in that process, this is normal. This is not abnormal. This is normal. This is just life. And we have to be responsible. And being responsible means that you're going to find yourself in this situation maybe once or twice, or even maybe 3 or 4 times in your life. This is normal. The key is how quickly you have a plan in place to get out of it. How quickly, going back to that secondary income or cutting expenses, how quickly to get out of this predicament.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah, I was just about to say that leads back to, we're gonna have to probably supplement our incomes, and we will have definitely an episode in the future on some income ideas, additional income ideas, side
course.
hustle ideas that we're gonna put out. Nathaniel, this was a great show. Let's give your contact so that anyone who wants to get in touch with you can get in touch.
No problem. So you can reach us at 1242 That's 1242 or send us an email at info@drubersolutions.com. That's info@drubersolutions.com. We look forward to connecting with you, having conversations with you, and helping you reach your desired goal.
That's it for today's episode. As always, I hope you found it helpful. Don't forget, if you haven't already, follow the show on social media and subscribe to the Money Sense with Sheandra YouTube channel. For additional information on the show, you can visit the show's website, moneysensewithsheandra.com. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you all next time.